Welcome to Minority Trip Report. MTR is a podcast spotlighting stories of personal transformation and underrepresented leaders in mental health, psychedelics, and consciousness. I'm your host, Raj Siraj. If you're learning from or enjoying Minority Trip Report, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Today, my guest is Henry Winslow, who is the founder of Tricycle Day, a free twice-a-week newsletter covering the top stories in psychedelic research, policy, and business that's actually fun to read. Henry, welcome.
Hey, Rod. Thank you so much for having me on. What's up, friends, listeners?
Yeah. Thanks for coming, Henry. I'm a big fan of your newsletter. We sort of connected through another friend last year. And honestly, I love the newsletter and so many others as well. Being a creator in this day and age involves so much more than just creating content. You really have to be an entrepreneur. And so, and the road of the entrepreneur is always zigzaggy, right? It's not straightforward. It's not linear. There's so many challenges and opportunities. So I'm really excited to dive into all that with you, as well as your formative years, formative experiences with psychedelics and so on. Where I do want to start though is this thing that you are, rather how you talked about your journey, how your journey started a couple of years ago. And in your own words, you said that you had walked away from Harvard and became a nomadic yoga teacher. And it was a thankless journey in the sense that it's not rewarding the capitalistic system, but it has been transformative for you. So give me a little, a flashback of how that came to be. You went to Harvard, but you quit and you said, I'm going to become a nomadic yoga teacher instead.
Yeah, well, I should clarify. I didn't walk away from Harvard per se. I had finished my schooling. And what I meant by that, I guess, is that I walked away from the traditional Harvard path, if you will, because, in a school like that, you can imagine there are a lot of folks who have been very type A, kind of linearly progressed, focused on taking the next step, always succeeding, earning that next achievement throughout life. And after Harvard, the next logical step is get, respectable, high paying job. For me, most of my friends were going into investment banking or management consulting. Those were kind of the popular paths. Not a lot of entrepreneurship, interestingly enough, though there was definitely some. But for me, I went into advertising, and specifically advertising in the medical and pharmaceutical and healthcare space. So that was my first job out of college. And when I got into it, I felt accomplished. I felt proud of myself for landing that kind of job. However, for the first time in my life, I kind of reflected on the fact that, hey, there's no obvious next step here. Yes, you can work your way up the corporate ladder, but it dawned on me that I'm here for a long time. And when everything is only like 4-year chapters, it's very easy to just put your head down, grind through it, and work your way to the next step. But when I was stuck in a situation where this could be the next, many decades of my life, suddenly the standards changed. So for me at that point, I was like, I don't know if I can do this. I had sort of a quarter life existential crisis, you might call it that. And that's when I started exploring entrepreneurship. Along the way, I had also picked up a very important practice to me, which is my yoga practice. A lot of my friends were kind of like joking that I'd become obsessed with it. A lot of transformation physically, mentally, personality wise. So that became, the first.
And Henry, just give me 1 second. Sorry.
Yeah.
I realized, okay, actually, never mind. Are you seeing a little bit of fuzziness on on your side, video wise?
No, I'm not.
Okay. All right. Might have been momentary. Okay. I apologize. I just wanted to make sure that everything was okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Keep going.
So So the path of entrepreneurship that really called to me, there were many other false starts and distractions, but was going full time into teaching yoga. And to your point before, that's not the most obvious way to make money. So clearly, my motivation to do that wasn't like, hey, this is a get rich quick scheme or even get rich slow scheme. It was, hey, this is a way that I can create impact in the world that is meaningful to me because it's allowing me to share what has been impactful in my own life with others. So that's how I got off of the Harvard path into yoga and alternative medicine.
It's interesting. Well, a number of guests of mine who've gone to elite schools like Harvard and Cambridge and so on have alluded to this thing about, elite schools cultivating type A personalities.
Yeah.
I wonder what that means or that has meant to you. And, in the world of entrepreneurship and like founders and billionaires, you often hear about people who had to quit elite schools first to actually go build something, which is kind of
Yeah.
ironic, right? You think you go to these schools to actually cultivate entrepreneurship, but then it feels like, nope, screw this. I'm actually going to go build something else. What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you think is happening there?
Well, I think that elite schools maybe cultivate type A personalities, but even more so than that, they attract type A personalities. So these are, personality traits, behavioral patterns, mental frameworks that have already long since been cultivated, probably through the
Mm,
influence of parents and other mentors in childhood. But yeah, it is very interesting that you see a lot of the success. Obviously, there's, survivorship bias here because there are many people who drop
right,
out of Harvard and other schools don't,
right.
create Facebook. But those anomalies are pretty striking for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying before. It's like you get into this habit of like, you must succeed. And if you must succeed, then that's not really conducive to entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is just the path of like repeated failures and lessons built upon them.
Right. It's interesting also from that perspective. I find MBA is really irritating because like, oh, I have not had the sunk cost of like $140,000. I have to believe I'm great and
Oh,
I'm awesome.
MBAs, yeah.
So yeah, like that resonates, but I kind of feel like it's maybe something like that. I obviously haven't gone to an elite school, so I don't know. But like my siblings have. That's super interesting. Where do you think your penchant for yoga? You picked it up during this time. What do you think yoga brought to your life, and why were you gravitating towards it, and why take it so seriously?
Yeah. So I had been an athlete growing up, usually like like a individual sport athlete. I was big into
Mm,
track and field, cross country, swimming, and my main sport growing up was diving, springboard diving. So I actually walked onto the springboard diving team at Harvard, and it was a big part of my experience there, not just because of the physical demands of it, which I think carry a lot of mental benefit and you learn a lot from that, and the camaraderie of being on a team. Um, but also, there's just an aspect of discipline that I found extremely important and beneficial in all ventures in life. So when I got out of college and I no longer had a structured, path for doing physical exercise, I was looking for something that could capture my
mm,
attention. And one of my friends who had been a diver with me brought me to my first yoga class and I immediately fell in love with it. I didn't realize it at the time because I think yoga works at a level that often, it goes beneath the superficial, conscious mind, but I felt really good afterward. Yes, it was fun. Yes, I got to work on tricks. I was always sort of like an acrobatic person in nature and I wanted to like do handstands and all of that. But at the end of class, just like being there in Shavasana and feeling like nothing has to
mm.
be done. You finally have a break. You just get to exist. That was incredibly healing for me and addictive in a way. I'm not ashamed to admit that it did sort of become an addiction. So I
Mhm.
developed, a very serious, consistent practice. I would practice every single day. It got to the point that, with a corporate job, the only way I could guarantee I'd got my yoga practice in was that I showed up for 6 a.m. class every day.
Holy shit. 6 a.m. I've tried that. It almost never works for me, but kudos to you. And again, comparing your statement about places like Harvard and which sort of attracts type A personalities, I'm not going to say it's a bad thing, but I do feel sometimes that the validation that one gets from a practice, and not just like, let's say going to yoga, but a practice to your point, which is inward looking, right?
Yeah.
Disciplined inward looking practice versus what feels like sometimes like, you're driven by some sort of programming from either society, parents, some sort of validation. You think that you're going to feel a certain way when you get to the destination.
Right. The
It's
recognition.
quite right. Quite the contrast, right? Society will reward you, will recognize you, will see you finally if you go to Harvard and so on. I think it's a very different value system. I'm not saying one's better than the other. I think it's a very different value system.
Yeah, and if you've, been immersed in one, then you can imagine like stepping over into the other can be refreshing, just the contrast.
Mhm. Did it? Did that practice validate your decision to not take the Harvard path or post Harvard path?
You're saying after I went
Yeah.
for it and was a
Mhm.
yoga teacher?
Mhm.
Not immediately, you know? I mean, I felt great about the work that I was doing, and that part was, energizing. Every day teaching a class and having people I've said before, it's, like, thankless in some senses, but in other ways, it's incredibly thanked. You
Mhm.
finish your class and your students are incredibly grateful, and then, it's the highlight of their day, and they express that.
Mhm.
So, that was very rewarding, um, and, I stayed with it, so obviously I made the calculus and decided I was doing the right thing.
How did you become nomadic with yoga?
So that was kind of a combination of one, like lifestyle design and two, financial necessity. So lifestyle design wise, like, look, if I can use my career, my job to expose myself to different parts of the world and travel, which are things that I value. I didn't have a lot of travel growing up. So, to expand my horizons was something that I always wanted to do, then
Mhm.
that's great. And then the financial piece was, as it turns out, as a yoga teacher, it's really difficult to make a living if you're just teaching regular classes at studios in the city that you live in, particularly a high cost of living city like New York, where I lived. So the way that we ended up making it work, and when I say we, I mean my wife and I, is we would go on these international workshop tours. So we, basically like either Airbnb our apartment or not have an apartment for a period and then go off for 3 or 4 months and just bounce between studio to studio in different countries, usually in Europe. And we'd either be resident teachers there for a week or 2 teaching on the regular schedule, or more often we would do special events. And you could make more money doing it that way because you would do this like revenue share agreement. Usually it was like
Mhm.
70-30 in favor of the teachers.
That's fantastic. In your travels, what are the highlights? Where have you been?
My favorite, and this actually falls outside of the description I was just giving you around the workshop tours, but we also did retreats. So that was something that we designed of our own and like, put up a sales page and invited people to come to. My favorite was Bali, Ubud. It's kind of like a
Mm,
yoga capital of the world at this point, like even more so than places in India, which is kind of crazy.
you're right.
But we had an amazing time there.
Do you see any sort of back when you saw like, when you're doing this? Are you seeing any similarities or how things have evolved while you talk about psychedelic retreats per se or retreats nowadays?
Yeah, so I've actually never been to a psychedelic retreat. All of my psychedelic experiences have been in small groups or individual. So I can't compare with direct experience, but it's definitely interesting to see that, there's a parallel for sure, observing from the outside. Yeah.
Interesting. We're going to touch more on this later on, but I want to pivot a little bit to how you grew up and your sort of formative years. I often think that entrepreneurs have always a interesting setting of their younger years or formative years, right?
Yeah.
Because for good and bad, we are informed by our surrounding, people that we grew up when we were young, siblings, parents, family and friends and so on. I'm wondering what your setting was when you were much younger, right? How was your family? Tell me a little bit about your siblings, your family, and so on.
Yeah. I love this question, Rod. And the reason why is because I actually have a lot more clarity around this now at age, what am I, 34, than I did even like at 29. And I actually attribute that to some of my psychedelic experiences, which you'll probably want to ask about later too. But the thing that's really interesting about this question is that, you know, yes, as a child, our set and setting are extremely formative, but also as a child, we have no basis of comparison. So everything feels normalized to everyone, no matter what your circumstances are. So I think that psychedelics have been really helpful for me and like stepping back and zooming out and looking at what happened from a more objective point of view. And so, with that perspective, what I can say about my childhood is yes, I had a lot of privilege for which I am grateful. And there were also some very serious challenges that I did not fully appreciate as a child, mostly around mental health struggles and challenges that were in my immediate vicinity, in my siblings, in my parents. and there's a connection there. Certainly there's like intergenerational transfer happening, which I'm extremely conscious of now as a new parent because I want to end that cycle. But I say all that, I guess, because it certainly set the stage for me. My interest in yoga. Yoga has incredible benefits for mental health, which are well documented, and also psychedelics. There's this renewed interest around psychedelics, not just as tools for cognitive and spiritual exploration, but also as therapeutic tools for mental health. And I think that's part of why I'm so gravitated toward them. In my childhood, there were very serious mental health breaks among my mom, to be specific, and siblings. So much so that I remember there was one moment where, as a child, like, it's really important that you see that your parents are presenting a united front. This is something I'm learning as a new parent. Like, if you
Mhm.
break that trust, then like the child feels very disoriented, not sure, like not safe. And that happened for me because my mom was struggling and, she had basically like a tantrum is the wrong word, but just she went wild. And my dad had to break that united front and say to me and to my brother, he's like, I might have to pick you guys up and leave. And so that was really scary. I also remember a moment where he took me to my mom and said like, "Hey, you need to tell Henry that you still love him." And this obviously trickled into my siblings, their mental health and the way that they went through life. There were several suicide threats, a couple earnest attempts, and some of my siblings, I mean, I'm not going to go into specifics, are still struggling with that to this day. So psychedelics and their importance in mental health have a lot of personal significance to me.
I really appreciate you sharing this, Henry, and trusting us with this. I think it's, there's a saying that the future is fixed, it's the past that's unpredictable. And I find with psychedelics, you can revisit your story. And each time as you do your own healing work, the past feels different. Whether you feel detached or it feels less threatening, or it feels you can look at it with more objectivity, to your point, or compassion. And so I think it's really powerful because you start with parents, family is the core wound in a lot of ways, right? And to be able to look at your parents and go like, they're also people, yes,
Yes.
they're parents. They're
Not
also
only are
just
they
people.
also people, but they're also children. That was a big
Right.
unlock for me, when you mentioned compassion, it made me think of that.
Mhm.
Realizing that my mom and, I love my mom and she loves me, but there were definitely some mistakes in the way that she treated, my
Mhm.
siblings. Not so much me, honestly, it was more the daughters. But I see now, I understand that that's because she's replaying something that happened from her mother to her. And, as a parent now, I realize like I'm doing this for the first time. Like I'm learning, I'm basically a quote unquote child of being a parent, like I'm new to this. And every parent does it for the first time.
Mhm. Mhm. Which speaks a lot to my experience, maybe I'm the eldest and perhaps the guinea pig experiment for my parents. But you brought up your grandmother and you shared with me a story, which on one hand, really beautiful, but tragic, but also really revealing. And I remember it. I'm wondering if you could recount the story and what it taught you. Is that you talked about your mom collecting antique dolls,
Mm.
and after your grandmother had passed away, your mom filled your grandmother's house with those antique dolls. And at some point, it was just full of dolls. Your
Yeah.
mom collected them.
Yeah.
Looking back, and I don't know if you talked to your mom about this or not, but what do you think that revealed? What was your mom doing?
I think that my mom was getting to act out a childhood that she was denied, essentially.
Mm.
I have talked to my mom about it, not like full on like therapy one-on-one, but like,
Right.
I mean, this is a big part of her life. She's member of multiple antique doll collecting clubs. She hosts these little luncheons at her house with these little old ladies who collect dolls. But yeah, I mean, from an outside point of view, most people would say that the collection is out of hand. Like, yes, she filled up her own mother's house, which she inherited after my grandmother passed away. She filled it up. She made it a life-sized dollhouse. So obviously, she's still working through that, and it just goes to show that you know some of these things you learn to live with for your entire life. I think the impacts that are impressed upon you as a child.
I can see that. On the other hand, I also wonder, like, this is where sort of life imitates art, right? Because I think here, expression, collection of collecting these things that you feel really called to, it's like collecting stamps. I'm a big nerd. I used to collect stamps, or back in the day when airlines would issue physical tickets, paper tickets that were like, that looked like checkbooks. I had like stacks and stacks of them because we didn't get to travel much. And for me, every trip that we did that we could afford with my family was a very special thing. And, of course, now it's everything electronic. But like, my point being that there's comfort in sort of these things, these actions. But to your point, at what point does it become something else is the
Yeah.
question, right?
Instead of you holding onto them, they're holding onto you, it seems.
Right, right. Is there some form of grieving or reconciliation now? I guess what I'm asking, what is the state of that house now? The dollhouse.
Actually, it's better. It's better now. There's been some downsizing. I think that
Mm,
there's been a lot of reluctance around that, but it's been, a joint effort from my dad and my sister, who was actually living in that house for a little while. She came back and moved into that house to take a job in Richmond, Virginia, where I grew up. Um, but she moved out, so we'll see if
that's
her space
progress.
gets reoccupied by dolls. Remains to be seen. The story continues.
How has your relationship with your family, dad, mom, your siblings? Because if we are to center, let's say, your mom's lived experience at that time, and each of
Mhm.
your relationship with her, how do you think bringing the medicine and the practice into the fold, how do you think that's evolved over time, and where is it now? How much do you attribute that to practice, your own role being a parent, and so on?
Sorry, can you just rephrase that question? There was a lot in there. I wanna make sure I'm answering it correctly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm just thinking, how does your relationships with your family evolved over time is what I'm saying, I guess.
I think that it's based on this idea of, like, understanding where they're coming from more, that I've developed a bit more compassion for my parents, and rather than seeing them as arbiters of truth, seeing them as just people who are doing
Mm,
their very best and are very much not necessarily defined, but shaped by their own experiences. Learning about my mom and her relationship to her mom definitely colored, my relationship with my own mom, because it helped me understand why she acted the way that she did. Also, learning about my dad's childhood helped. His dad was not in the picture. So
mm,
that I think that really taught him or encouraged him to be different. He wanted to, instead of replaying the same patterns that he had been exposed to, he said, I'm gonna break the cycle, right? I'm gonna do things differently. So I'm gonna be a really present father. I'm gonna stick around no matter what happens. Divorce is not an option. I feel the same way. It's like you make that commitment, that's for life. And I respect that. I respect that a lot.
Okay, Henry, we're back after a 20-minute technical disruption that is super annoying, but hopefully it doesn't disrupt our conversation flow too much. Where we were is that I had asked, with your experience with medicine and your journey so far, how has your relationship with the rest of your family, your mom, your dad, your siblings, how has that evolved with it?
Yeah. I think that of all the medicines that I've worked with, certainly psilocybin is the one that has changed the way that I've reflected and engaged with relationships in my family. And we can talk about that and the differences between the medicines later if you like. But I think the material impact is that I've developed more compassion for where people come from. And everybody likes to believe that they're empathic and empathetic, but, everything is relative, right? And if you can notice your own change, your own evolution and empathy, it kind of puts in perspective where you were before, which was, for me, admittedly more self-centered. Just not necessarily in like an egotistical way, I guess, but like just this is my experience. I'm at the center of my own universe and everybody is interacting with me. Whereas now I recognize that my
Mhm.
parents, my siblings have all had unique experiences that very much shape the way that they show up in the world. And so I was talking earlier about my mom and her relationship with her own mother and how that played out in her doll collecting and the way that she's, become a mother to my sisters. I could say the same thing about the way that I've reflected on my dad's upbringing. He when he grew up, his dad was not in the picture. He was raised by a single mom. And so for him, I feel that he took the opposite approach, which is instead of to relive his or like re-engage in a childhood that he never got to have, he said, I'm going to interrupt this pattern. I'm going to be very different. I'm going to commit to being around and I'm going to be the dad to my kids that I didn't have. So I like that response. I respect that. I admire that about him. But if I'm being totally honest with you, I think the beautiful expected answer to this is like, oh yeah, I healed all my relationships with my family. And that's not the
No.
case for me. It gave me more awareness, but really like the thing that I realized was important to me as a result of some of these medicine experiences that reflected on my childhood was I get a chance to do this however I want. I'm stepping into a different chapter of adulthood where now I have my own nuclear family. I've got a wife, I have a son at that time on the way, but now, he's 17 months old. And look, this is the most important thing now. And my relationships to my siblings and parents are important, but they're not as important. I've made that decision. They are not as important as the relationships I have within my nuclear unit.
Mm, interesting. And I want to talk about that perspective as well. But let me flip that previous question and say, how are your, let's say, family members experiencing you? Like the Henry that has evolved and become the person today. What do you think they're noticing? If you're truly channel that empathic sense that you talk about, put yourself in your dad's shoes and your siblings' shoes, and what are they seeing? Who do you think Henry is now versus the Henry they grew up with?
I think that my dad is incredibly supportive of everything that I've done, even when I've taken swings that did not seem advantageous.
Or fair?
Like walking away from, a good corporate job and being a yoga teacher. He thought that was awesome. And in fact, I inspired him to develop a yoga practice of his own,
Right.
which changed his life. So that's been great to have that. I think my mom is a little bit more scarcity mindset oriented and has had some fears around, riskier decisions I've made, but ultimately very much loves me and supports what I do. And my siblings, I think, I'm the youngest of 5, and I've always been the baby. There's they're all relatively close in age, like 2 years gap between each one, and there was a 5-year gap before me. So I
Mhm.
didn't have the typical sibling experience where you're fighting and all of this. Like, yes, of course, there were fights, but I was kind of like the nurtured baby that was kinda different. So I think they kind of look at me as like, this is funny. He does weird stuff. Now he's off doing psychedelics, but I don't think they judge it. I think they just say, Henry's being Henry.
What you tell us psychedelics? You talk to your family about it? Like, what do they know about psychedelic, either directly or indirectly through you?
I haven't talked to my siblings a ton about it, but I have talked to my dad because actually my first impression ever even
Mhm.
encountering or hearing about psychedelics was that my mom let it slip to me when I was in middle school or something. She's like, your dad's the one who sampled the magic mushrooms in college. So I knew that he would not have a problem with it. And,
Of course.
he also went to Harvard and he
Mm.
was there. He graduated in 1970. So he was there not long after the crowd, the scene. Yeah. Yeah. Like he actually was in school at the time when there was a whole semester where the student body just boycotted class because of the Vietnam War. And he wasn't super politically active, but he was like, yeah, cool. We could just get to smoke weed and go to museums all day.
That's
So
amazing.
yeah, he thinks it's cool, and he sends me tips and scoops for the newsletter. Usually, I've already seen them, but I just think it's
Mm.
fun that he's engaged and supports Tricycle Day.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think like Harvard at that time with Richard Schultes doing his work as well. Although he did his work, I think a decade or two earlier than that. But yeah, what a fascinating place. And of course, now you see Harvard Law coming into the psychedelic scene and things like
Mhm.
that again. That whole practice coming back again. It's interesting.
Yeah, there's a
Let's talk about
partnership with Berkeley.
right, right. Let's talk about psychedelics for a second. And your newsletter is about that. We talked about our journeys and experiences, but the two medicines that you frequently cite, or in terms of a meaningful experience, you talk about Bufo, various, or
Yeah.
5-MeO-DMT, and then MDMA. Both are very meaningful, and I've recently experienced MDMA in a therapeutic context, not just recreational, which was super powerful with my wife and a number of other couples together, which was beautiful. But I'm curious, citing those two medicines in particular, why was it most meaningful to you, and how do you see them differently?
They're very different in some very stark ways, but also I find that they have some similarities. I'll also say that I think psilocybin has been incredibly
Mm,
powerful and important for me. But focusing on the two that you brought up. So Bufo or 5-MeO-DMT, also another disclaimer I'll say before I get into it is at the time I was, Bufo was not as popular as it is now. And I also did not have all the information that I have now. So now I would definitely not recommend using Bufo just because of the concerns around overharvesting of the toads. And also there's a lot of danger now with like Mexican cartels like stepping in to the
mhm,
space. So it's
mhm,
really easy to, procure synthetic 5-MeO DMT. And I've had both and they both produce a reliably
mhm,
spiritual, game-changing experience. So, I would go with synthetic at this point. However, my first time was with organic toad-derived Bufo alvarius 5-MeO DMT.
mhm,
And it was it was the experience for me. I think we were talking before we recorded at one point, and it was like, for that experience, there was a before and there was an after. Like, it was a pivotal
mhm,
experience for me in understanding who I am, what reality is, and what it means to experience being human. For me, the reason that it even came into my life was, as I mentioned before, I was very deep in my yoga practice. And in yoga, they teach this system. There's an eightfold path. And the final step in the eightfold path of yoga, there actually is an end state of yoga called yoga. And it's also called samadhi. And samadhi is described in the Yoga Sutras and many other Vedic texts as an experience of dissolution of the illusion of duality. So no longer is there, this mask of it's you and everything else. There is just one, and that's
mhm,
like, people talk about that with psychedelics, and they use the phrase ego death, which I think is kind of a scary term. Not that we should run away from fear necessarily, but that puts it in sort of almost like a negative light. When for me, that experience of dissolution into oneness was nothing but pure beauty, love, like the most unconditional, welcoming
mhm,
feeling that I've ever experienced in my life. So much so that as it came on and, while my mind was still working and still could produce, concepts and words in the English language, the last thought that I remember speaking to myself with the voice of my mind was, "Nothing else matters. You made it.
mhm,
This is the
mhm.
point of existing. This is why you were born." And yeah, that's why it changed me, like after that I realized like there's a reason to exist and it's to feel this feeling, which is love. I believe that.
That's beautiful. In what ways do you feel that experience manifested after in your life and still to this day?
It's really difficult to come back to that completely immersive feeling without help. And by help, I mean some sort of external substance or potentially a practice. I mean, I think you
Mhm,
can get to a similar experience using your breath. I love breath work for that. But really, I think the practical takeaway from it is like, look, you can remember that you had that experience. And that provides a level of comfort, confidence, context that just allows all of the challenges and like bumps in the road
mhm.
of life to feel okay. Like they don't matter as much. And it brings a level of playfulness and joy into life by removing the weight off of your shoulders.
I think that's really beautiful advice and a very practical perspective because, like Thich Nhat Hanh has this idea of like micro meditations, right? Throughout the day. When you're brushing your teeth, take a moment. When you're drinking some water, take a moment, right? Every
Yeah.
moment can be that moment of reflection. And like as human beings, particularly this time, I felt like there's we have to, on one hand, balance either great aspirations and ambitions along with fear that the world is crumbling, falling apart, completely unraveling.
Hmm.
And also remember that we're just human beings having a human experience. And
Yeah.
then we have to find joy among all the violence and everything else that's happening in the world, right?
Right.
And I think your perspective is really pointed in the sense that we can find moments of elevation or sort of transcendence or samadhi, as you said, in that. So I think that's really beautiful. Thanks for sharing that.
Of
What about
course.
MDMA?
Yeah.
Very
So
different, of course, but what are the
yeah, very
overlaps on
different. And I
being
have
different?
a lot less experience with MDMA. I don't know if you want me to say this on the podcast, but my experience with MDMA, chemically pure MDMA, and what I would consider to be a more intentional container was through you. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Yeah, we were at like a social gathering, an after party at an industry event, and you offered it to me, and I said, sure. And I kind of expected it just to be like, a mood enhancer for a party situation, like make the music feel a little bit more vibrant and feel it in my body a bit more. And while that was the case, the real benefit of the medicine and the experience that I'll take with me came after that. We had a relatively early night. I think, I was back at my Airbnb by 11:30, and I expected that to be, my wind down time, but that's when I just tuned in a way
Mm.
that I did not expect. I just felt very viscerally connected to my body at first, and then, the attention and awareness went into my heart, and I could feel my heart just warming. It felt super cozy, warm, fuzzy, and just like a really pleasant way. And then that feeling of being connected to my heart changed my thoughts, and that's the important part. I started to feel a sense of gratitude, and, like, my immediate impulse was to think about all the people in my life who I was grateful for, and I pulled out my phone, and I started writing all these, like, thank you notes. Fortunately, I had the wherewithal not to fire them off or compose them in the text at that moment, but I just saved them for myself. Some of them I shared
Mm.
later, some I did not. And I had, a few hours there to reflect on like what I wanted to take with me from this, like, sort of a pre-integration. And I realized that my my ideas around my business were limited by a sense of needing to hold on to control. And this may feel like a big jump, but for me, it really started from feeling other people's wants, desires, hopes, aspirations, and recognizing that building a team for a business, which is something I had never really done before, is not about, you know, convincing people to do something for you or leveraging people's skills for your interests. Yes, that can happen, but you're also doing something for them. People want to be a part of something. People want to contribute to something that's bigger than themselves. That was a big unlock for me with Tricycle Day, and a big part of what allowed me to take the next step for the business, which is building out an agency. This is like a media company that started just as a newsletter, monetized through sponsorships. But now we have this like service business underneath it, and I've got a small team that's helping me do it. So I don't think that would have happened without MDMA.
That's beautiful. I really appreciate the sort of attribution there. This is really like sort of the fantastic perspective. Again, very practical, whether you're, it's for your family or building a business. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But, sort of understanding that whatever you do in life, it's really about aligning values, right? Aligning a vision. And hopefully the vision is, is inferred from your value set. And I really resonate with that because at any one time, there's a billion things you can build. There's a billion things, billion people you can follow. If you're going to follow your heart, recognizing that you can't, like, nobody is really self-made. I've sort of rejected that idea wholeheartedly, Ram,
Mhm.
because whether you have mentors, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whether it's like bosses, whatever, you need help. Everybody needs a guiding hand. Everybody needs
Mhm.
some sort of advice, right? Trusting the fact that you're going to have to sell a vision. Sell is the wrong word, but you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
people want to have to opt in into your vision,
Yeah.
and conviction is really important in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Why should people work with you? never mind for you, but why should we work with you, right? It's certainly the reason why I wanted to work with you. And big fan. Newsletter is great, but also having the privilege of knowing the person behind it certainly wants me to, be a bigger fan and support.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess this is something that I have not intentionally manufactured, which is, I think, a good thing. It's
Mm,
just I'm letting it happen
mm,
naturally. And in some senses, I'm not even always aware of what's motivating me until some time has passed and I look back. And in hindsight and with reflection, you kind of understand what pulled you along a certain path. But for me, the choice to do something in psychedelics, it feels like I am contributing something of real import and significance and meaning in the world. You know, you know this as well as I do. Entrepreneurship offers potentially a lot of upside, but there's also a lot that you compromise, that you sacrifice to start a business. Like it's a lot easier to just make a steady living, working a job and getting a paycheck. And you can make good money doing that. Like I was making good money when I worked at healthcare advertising firms. So to step away, whether it was to go be a yoga teacher or now to do Tricycle Day and kind of educate the masses around the possibilities of psychedelics, is a choice where I'm putting away the possibility of, immediate gratification in the form of a paycheck in terms of like feeding my heart and soul by doing something that I think can actually help people in a really significant, meaningful way. So that's what's motivating me. I think it's like, it's not hard to convince people that that's why I'm doing it, because why else would you? Like, there's so many easier ways to make money.
I totally agree with you. And I've done a lot of things, and I've become increasingly convinced that entrepreneurship is really the only way perhaps to change the world. And now I'm going to add, I think the word entrepreneurship, being a founder, has been hijacked by a certain idea of what that looks like, right? Tech CEOs and
Yeah.
billionaires and so on,
Yeah.
and
Founders
lifestyle
tend more
entrepreneurs.
associated with startup, like
Yeah,
venture
yeah.
back.
But for me, entrepreneurship is really about having a true sense of agency, right?
Mm.
Now, to your point, why would you want to be a founder or entrepreneur? Why would you put through yourself moment by moment, the sort of the paralyzing doubt that comes with entrepreneurship? Like, I'm going to feed my family. I'm going to feed myself. I'm going to pay my bills. And that's, it's like every day is a different roller coaster, right?
Yeah.
But I think the beauty of that, the upside, even without the payout at the end, let's say necessarily, is to say that at least I'm acting with agency, right?
Yeah.
Heart and soul, I'm doing what I believe in. And that's a great
Yeah.
practice for anywhere. Like, even if you're an activist, it's like saying,
Totally.
I'm doing this and I know what drives me. I know why I'm doing
Yeah. Or an artist for that matter.
it. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think with startups, it's funny, right? Like, all startup founders, again, whatever that startup might be, start out as artists because you're wrestling with ambiguity. All art and expression is wrestling ambiguity and giving form to abstract ideas or thoughts. You eventually become a scientist because that's where replication and sort of
Mm.
like scale comes into being. But you start as an artist.
That's a great point. That's true. You got to start from nothing and you have no data to make your decisions off in the beginning. Later, it becomes systematized. You add your SOPs, you replicate, maybe you hire people to execute the systems. In the beginning, you just got to make it up. And that's the
Exactly.
fun part, isn't it?
Exactly. Exactly. When you see it working, of course, but the thing is, like, we don't have a feedback, we were like, you just drive yourself nuts, right? Speaking about 0 to 1, so taking that step, you've gone instead 0 to 37,000 at last count. You just passed your first year anniversary, which is like
Mm.
insane to me. Congratulations. Like,
Thank you.
what a pleasure it's been for me, at least personally. When I met you, you were at like 19,000 subscribers, I think. And
Okay.
you're 37 at last count, as from what I've read.
Yeah.
Might be
38
higher.
now.
Not 38 now. Fuck.
Yeah.
Like last week that I read this.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, when you started, why start another newsletter? There were a few, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it, but like, obviously that's the question. Like, what are you bringing to the table that's going to be different? Why did you have conviction in this idea? one? And then, how is it going? Is it, did you imagine coming this far? What worked? What were the challenges and so on?
Okay. So first, why the newsletter? Well, I had been a reader of newsletters and I was like kind of naturally taking an audit of the space just by virtue of being a consumer myself. And from my point of view, obviously I had not seen everything, but from what I could see, it seemed that there was a big missing piece in the media landscape around psychedelics. From what I could tell, it seemed that there were materials that spoke to people who are very much immersed in the space, knew the language, whether that's legal, medical, what have you. So kind of like high level requires a lot of literacy to get. There was that. And then on the total other end of the spectrum, we had, alternative news sources that are speaking more to the neo spiritual crowd, 5D consciousness, that kind of almost like pseudoscience
Mhm.
language. And to me, it seemed that, if you imagine a bell curve of the people who could be interested in this content, there's a big section in the middle that is the biggest, and it's also growing because now psychedelics are going mainstream and they were being underserved. They weren't being spoken to. So I wanted to write to them. And my insight there was like, look, they don't have all of the knowledge. It's more of like a basic level of understanding. Maybe, it's not saying they're not smart people, but they just don't know what's going on in psychedelics. And also, they could be alienated by this like kind of woo woo talk. So I'm going to write from a voice that's easy to understand, fun to follow, and even injects a little bit of humor, which I can understand for some people is polarizing because these are sacred substances. They're not really heavy topics. But that was an intentional decision, which I knew would, to my point earlier, kind of might alienate some, but it's going to speak to a group that does not have a news source currently. And it seems to have taken hold. It's grown very quickly. In just over a year, we've gotten to 38,000 active subscribers, and a highly engaged audience too. I think that's super important to
Mhm.
because it shows more than just, a list of emails that you're collecting, that people are actually reading and responding, engaging, clicking through to links, all good indicators that people value, the information that I'm putting out there.
How do you gauge engagement? You just mentioned. So, of course, clicking through and opening your newsletter and stuff. Like, how, in your mind, let's just say, talk about industry standards or your segment standards, best
Mhm.
practice, and so on. How do you gauge your engagement?
Yeah, open rate, click through rate are like the standard metrics. I watch those constantly. Right now, the average trailing 4 weeks open rate is 53+%, which I think is really great.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, like industry agnostic, I think, a benchmark is like 20%. So that's obviously including, promotional emails from brands that are selling a product. So I
Mhm.
understand I'm in a position where my product is the email itself, so it should be higher. And then click through rate is like, around 6 to 7% at any given time. So I'm
Mhm.
happy with those. But there's some other like less tangibles. Like there's a poll feedback form at the bottom of every newsletter where I just ask people to rate that issue and they can
Mhm.
choose like it's a scale of 1 to 3 basically. And I look at those, they can just put in the rating or they can fill in like a dialogue box and provide more commentary. So I read all of those and often respond to some of them. I love to see what resonates with people. People also reply directly to the emails and start
Mhm.
a conversation. I think a lot of people don't realize there's like a human being on the other side, so they don't
All
know
right.
they can do that. So I encourage that. I think it's awesome when people reply to the email. And then the last one is how people engage with like the kind of lighter stuff on Instagram. I know I'd put out a good meme if it gets a lot of shares. Because Instagram tells you every time somebody shares it to their story. So I
Mhm.
always people for sharing when they do.
How do you design a good meme?
Yeah, I mean, so earlier you're talking about like the art of business. That's one thing that's impossible to systematize, which is fun. It keeps things interesting and playful. For me, there are a few different ways I come up with it. One is just as I'm writing the newsletter or like taking in the news, the sources that feed into the newsletter. I'm like, okay, what is there a meme out there that applies to this that I can riff on? That's one way. Another is following other meme content creators in totally different niches. and
Mm.
see if I can take their thing and apply it to psychedelics. Yeah, I mean, those are probably the two main inputs of how I come across it. The thing about memes is like you're not supposed to be totally original. It's how do you
Yeah,
respond to what's already, popular in the zeitgeist.
the remixing the meme and having a new interpretation is the whole point, right?
That's the whole point. Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully having a hilarious interpretation that is also kind of true. I totally agree with you. Your point about this sort of chasm that exists between extreme pain and peak performance. And in the peak performance bin, I put like not only biohackers, but like super woo, culty, bordering on superstition kind of like content,
Mhm.
not judging, but yes, maybe judging. But,
Yeah.
putting that, but there's a giant chasm in the middle, which is like people who want to find more reliable information, maybe find a safe way to experience the medicine. But also, like, I kind of feel there's a huge opportunity in talking about how do you integrate these in your day to day life. I do feel that you have to come to baseline and heal your core wounds, and that's an ever growing process.
Yeah.
But there's also like, how do I use it to become a better partner, a better founder, a better friend, a better, husband or whatever. I think that's really important, right? One thing, where do you want Tricycle Day to go? Like, what does, let's say, a Tricycle Day in 2024, 2025 look like? What's the next evolution?
Yeah. So first year for me was all about growth because I recognized that if I didn't have an audience, then, I couldn't do anything with it. Like I'd be writing into the ether. So I
Mm,
really prioritized that. I put a lot of my own savings into growth as well. And in 2024, I feel like I have a nice, healthy foundation in terms of an audience. So I've scaled back a bit on just like hammering the growth. Also because I need to make a living out of it. So I paid myself for the first time this year in January.
Amazing. Congratulations.
Profits from Tricycle Day, which is awesome. So I just want to keep going, kind of continue doing what I'm doing as far as the like newsletter side. And then I'm also going hard into this agency to see how I can, serve our sponsors and advertising partners even better.
Amazing. I'm so excited to see this next chapter. It's been an absolute privilege to follow you so far. Last question as we sort of bring this podcast to sort of its logical conclusion, for lack of a better word,
Mhm.
is what advice do you have for one, young parents, young dads, a lot of people who started families in recently couple of years, with the perspective that you've shared so far about not not doing sort of this intergenerational transference of trauma and hardships and difficult ideas or thoughts. Sorry. And then second thing, what advice do you have for founders, people who want to start the entrepreneurship journey, want to create something, want to build something?
Yeah. Okay. So the parent one. First, I just want to acknowledge that I think it's almost like a little bit silly for me to be giving advice because I'm so green myself. However, everybody's opinion is valid, right?
Let's call it
So,
perspective.
yeah,
Advice is, I think it's, yeah, let's call it perspective.
I would say, you know, because everyone has different, unique, personally formed values, the most important thing to do stepping into parenthood is to reflect and become very intentional about the way that you show up for your kid. Because it's very easy otherwise to just slide into habit, um, especially when you're so challenged on things like sleep. You just
Mhm.
want it, like, you want to avoid friction and you want to just like do whatever is natural. But I believe in the grand scheme, that is not the appropriate path to take. And that you have a very limited window when children are just so, so impressionable. They're talk about psychedelics, neuroplasticity. Children's brains are so plastic that everything you do
Mhm.
influences them. So I would just be very, very mindful of that and establish habits, behaviors, model behavior that you would like to see them approach and recognize as normal. And then on the founder side, I guess I would say n- prioritize distribution. That would be my advice. It's a lot easier to sell something, whether that's a product, service, whatever, if you have an audience that already knows, likes, and trusts you. So you got to play the patient, like play the long game, be patient, and it takes work to do that. But you can do it with no money, even because of discoverability engines like social media platforms. Like you could build an audience there And then once you've developed sort of a subject matter expertise or authority in some niche, like it's a lot easier to launch a business off of that than out of nowhere from zero.
Mm, great advice. And somebody who is not great at building distribution yet, I take that to heart. And I think that's really good advice. Henry, this has been a fantastic conversation. I just want to thank you again for being vulnerable, for opening up and sharing all your perspectives and learnings. I think it's, again, as somebody who is a fan of the newsletter and watched you as a friend build this thing, it's such a pleasure. I feel like I'm working with an artist, looking at her, watching an artist build something new and special. So I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Rod. I really appreciated this conversation and the intention and care that you brought to it. For the listeners out there, you should know, like, this isn't just like an off the cuff thing. We spoke beforehand. He had a whole idea around how we could frame the arc of the story, not, putting words in my mouth or anything like that, but he wants this show to be valuable in a way that is different from other shows out there. And I really appreciate that. That's the artist in you. You're creating something different here.
Thanks so much, Henry. I really appreciate you. And yeah, to bigger and better things.
Absolutely. We'll keep going.
Right on.
This podcast was brought to life with the help of Carolyn Tripp on art and design. Thanks so much for listening to Minority Trip Report. If you're learning from or enjoying the podcast, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. It's a zero-cost way to support us and help us spread the word. Please also sign up with your email for new episode announcements, events, as well as our forthcoming newsletter. I'm your host, Rod Suraj. See you next time.